and started my doctoral research, which was supposed to be about the children's services system in Scotland. And there was a kind of odd convergence between those two things, because while working in the third sector, I came across a lot of families and situations that suggested that the policy assertions, policy aspirations in Scotland, both to be more welcoming towards migrants and also to make Scotland the best place in the world for children to grow up, were simply not being realised for families that I was seeing in everyday practice. So I have a couple of examples, anonymised examples, which I think are really illustrative of the kinds of things I'm going to be talking about today. So one family who had arrived in the UK to study and stayed on to work, and for several years had lived as, I guess, you'd be labelled visa overstayers and undocumented, with no recourse to public funds, had been moving around in different informal accommodation arrangements, and then approached the local authority social work department for help and support. Legally speaking, the local authority has an obligation and a duty to provide accommodation and support in these situations. But the experience of this family was that the authority was hostile, aggressive, threatening, actively colluding with the Home Office, and that when they did provide support, it was so inadequate and so limited that it actually contributed to food insecurity, health crisis, and hospitalisation for one of the family members. Our family, the middle example, is a family who had arrived to seek refuge in the UK, and one of their children had significant developmental and physical impairments that were not being, had not been assessed and had not been supported. And I think around a year that they lived in Scotland, and had gone from a situation where they'd been receiving 24-hour care before migrating, and then zero in Scotland. And no organisation and no public body or third sector body had actually taken any responsibility. When the social work department did become involved, first of all, they were very clearly baffled at the situation. And when they carried out an assessment and offered support, the principles of self-directed support, the idea that people have the right to be given control over a budget that they can then spend on resources and organisations on help, wasn't offered to them on equal terms as it would be offered to anybody else, because their migration status prevented them from accessing that money. And in the third situation, with difficulties for a family struggling to access educational provision for one of their children who was deaf. And there's also one kind of borderline age bracket for school or for further or higher education. And those struggles were the kind of main things that were happening in the situation were negotiating the complex dynamics of family perceptions for whom deafness was a medical issue and a health issue that might be resolved. The school, for whom, frankly, it seemed to be an inconvenience. And for local deaf organisations and communities, for whom being deaf as a source of linguistic and cultural identity, connection and belonging, and not necessarily a disability. And in all these situations, despite the different circumstances, the different migration histories and trajectories, there seemed to be a number of shared experiences. Firstly, the sense that precarious migration status, in whatever form, was had particular shared impacts and was having a significant negative effect on child and family well-being. That it created particular needs, often sustained pre-existing needs and challenges, and exacerbated them. And that the services that were nominally designed to help and support families in these circumstances just didn't seem to be a very good fit. And practitioners often seemed confused or uncertain or unsure because they couldn't quite reconcile the ideas of disability with the ideas of migration, with the ideas of family and childhood in a way that they could make sense of. And ultimately, I think what I found, and the impression I got, and this became the focus of my doctoral research, was that the current system was not only failing to meet the needs of families and children in these circumstances, but also it was actively contributing to the harmful conditions that they were experiencing. So the doctoral study that I carried out had a number of key research questions, a qualitative study with some participatory methods. What I'm focusing on today are these latter two service-focused questions. And there's a kind of breakdown of the participants. 15 professionals in the third sector, 11 parents and 7 families, consented to interviews. And with children and young people, I carried out an eco-mapping exercise. And for anyone who doesn't know, an eco-map is a visual representation of connections. In the middle, we find the person who you're speaking to, and they draw around the outside the important influences, sources of support and stress in their lives. And the lines denote whether they are sources of stress and support. A solid line or multiple solid lines are sources of support. A dotted line is for sources of stress. So in this one, you can see the Home Office on the left and the social workers up at the top. And a crossed off line, such as the one going down to the school, is a mix. If there are kind of conflicting feelings or ambiguous ambivalent feelings. So, notes have all gone in the wrong order. So with that kind of experience of shared experience that seemed to cross over the boundaries of status and the boundaries of different forms of status. Sorry, my notes have gone absolutely bananas, so I'm going to have to improvise a little bit here. Give me 1 second. I had to decide who actually this research was going to be about and who it was going to focus on. And it proceeded from the base point that immigration status is not a descriptive entity, but is an evaluative label that's ascribed to people based on categories, often of deservingness, often of a kind of hierarchy of deservingness and a hierarchy of welcome that's determined by political prerogatives. So the families that I've worked with in this study moved in steps and staging the cycles between different forms of status, between different spaces and places, and a single static label simply didn't work, didn't meet those, didn't reflect those realities. A person might never claim asylum, but still have a fear of violence or repression. And similarly, some of the households contain multiple family members with multiple forms of status, and often children who had never actually migrated, had never travelled, but were still considered migrants by virtue of their parents' forms of status. So these categories really distinguish and divide and discriminate between different types of movement, positioning some people as migrants and some migrants as problematic and requiring punitive forms of control. Ideas of order and disorder, legitimacy and illegitimacy, that research shouldn't recreate, but should actually actively question and try to get underneath. And I think one of the key things here is that for all these are evaluative, not descriptive categories, they do have a real and serious impact upon people's rights and the resources available to them, the relationships and even their identities as they're formed in circumstances of real structural vulnerability and difficulty. So rather than pick people in specific migration categories, I decided to rely on a couple of things. First of all, the definition on the right of status precariousness from the Goldring paper, which covered anybody, you might say, in circumstances of deportability or in circumstances of precarity with any of these elements. So work authorization, the right to permanently remain or to remain independently of someone else's status and without access to social citizenship rights. And then combining that with Frantz Fanon's work on being and non-being, and something that really accounts for the unifying experience of these families, despite their many, many differences. That sense that they lived in the zone of non-being where they were denied full access to identity as human beings, and also the rights, the privileges and the freedoms associated with that. And then subjected to what we would call necropolitical power. So power that's expressed by the government in order to cause people to suffer, and in some circumstances threatening to and actually resulting in death and destruction. So, give me one moment. People who've used Fanon in migration research are very persuasively point out the continuities with colonialism and current systems of migration government. And colonialism and family have had a very particular relationship in settler colonialism and also in migration, where reproduction and childhood and family and parenting are really central to the ways in which empire and imperial power are articulated and also experienced. So often there have been the imposition of social mores and social norms from colonizers onto colonized populations, attempts to protect colonizers from the hazards represented by other family forms and other forms of intimacy, and attempts to control and draw parameters around family life in the name of public protection, moral protection, social protection. And one of the really key articulations of this, and more people are writing about this now, is this idea of childhood, universal childhood, what it is to be a child and what it is to be a family. And the idea that there is a universal childhood is a space of vulnerability, dependence, and innocence, and other children deviate from that in ways that are considered risky. And I'll talk in a second about a couple of examples of that. So children, migrant children and children in colonised communities are often viewed as both vulnerable and as threatening, and parents as responsible for ensuring that they grow up to be the right kind of child and the right kind of person, and often placed in positions that frame them as being deficient, requiring either outright exclusion at the border or requiring intervention. The history of family separations and the use of residential schools in some settings is a really key part of that. Forced adoptions, current practice in the United States, for example, with families is often to deport parents and put children in adoptive families. In the US is a really clear expression of a lot of this. And repeated attempts in the United Kingdom to separate families who've been made destitute as a consequence of their migration status. This pops up all the time, has been piloted in the mid-2000s, then stopped, and is often suggested as a means of both punishing families for remaining in the UK, but also protecting children from their deficient and irresponsible parents. And this next slide has lots and lots of examples, some of which we might touch upon just now. I'm conscious of time, conscious of not being too stuck with this stuff. So, you know, a lot of this stuff goes back further, even than I'm going to talk about here, but the kind of management of intimacy and the management of family life in the name of public protection and migration government is visible in things like British women losing their citizenship when they marry non-British citizens, citizenship not being passed directly from mothers to children until 1981. The primary purpose rule, again from the 20th century, where a marriage was not allowed solely for the reasons of a husband's settlement in the UK. So we start to see lots of gendered things going on here as well, to deter against kind of economic migration, particularly from the Indian subcontinent. I've talked a little bit about age assessment and the provisions for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children designed to prevent abuse of the system by bogus children, adults, people who are not considered childish enough to meet the universal childhood standards, and who represent not only a threat to other children if accommodated with them, but also to society. And a lot of the narrative around young military-aged men is a real expression of this. Family visas have become increasingly stringent. There are income requirements and language requirements to protect against both economic burden and cultural difference. The use of no recourse to public funds, probationary periods designed to protect the economy, the values and principles of society, as the Home Office put it, for people who might not integrate, and their children who potentially become threatening if they are not properly integrated into the system. Narrowed routes to regularisation and settlement for people who have spent time undocumented. So previously, if a child lived in the UK for 7 years, they could reasonably rely on a precedent that meant that they might be granted some path to settlement, and that no longer holds. Relationships established under periods of so-called illegality can't be used in support of an application. There have been lots of attempts to strip legal aid rights from children, and increases in the length of time that it takes for people to reach a state of permanent settlement, along with the really ridiculous fees that have been applied. Limited leave to remain and ILR, I guess that covers that. The use of a good character requirement for children's citizenship applications. If the child is not seen to be a sufficiently good character, they can be denied citizenship. And the last example, going again, it should come a little earlier, but the use of invasive virginity testing to test the authenticity of women arriving in the UK as spouses are all examples of the ways in which family and intimacy and relationships have been used to govern and to exclude based on kind of moral characteristics. And really the kind of conclusion with a lot of this is that rights-based discourse is often used both in migration and in children's rights movements are limited to people who are granted the privileges, essentially, of being citizens and being considered fully human. So rights have been reserved consistently. The Refugee Convention only really applied to displaced Europeans pre-1951 to exclude colonial populations from applying for protection based on the actions of colonizers. And then in the 1980s and the early 1990s, the reservation placed on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child from the UK, and really only the UK, to say that we would quite happily accept the UNCRC, except in the case of those who do not have the right under the law of the UK to enter and remain. That reservation has since been repealed. In 2009, Section 55 of whatever act that was in 2009. But the provisions that have replaced that reservation still have serious reservations in them. Things like child well-being, child rights, child welfare that are considered paramount considerations in processes involving children are actually considered to be discretionary, primary, but not the only consideration. Things to be taking account of or to have due regard for when it comes to children subject to immigration and control. And consistently research, but also the Joint Committee on Human Rights in Parliament has found that the principles of child welfare and child rights are constantly adapted for immigration priorities. And I think the most recent, or one of the more recent examples of this is when the Scottish Government attempted to incorporate the UNCRC domestically and was denied the possibility of doing this by the Supreme Court on the grounds that it would interfere with devolved responsibility or reserved responsibilities. Essentially, though this isn't explicitly said in the ruling or in the arguments, if Scotland attempts to extend the UNCRC to migrantized children, that gets in the way of the UK government's attempt to deny them of their rights under the law. So, following on from this, we have things relating to the hostile environment and the experiences of everyday bordering, that bring bordering practices into people's everyday lives. The hostile environment attempting to make life unlivable for so-called illegal migrants, so those living beyond the accepted categories, and doing several things that I think are particularly relevant to my PhD work, but also to the work I'm proposing to do in the future. Particularly welfare chauvinism and the denial of access to welfare provisions based on those categories of worth. So asylum support, no recourse to public funds, denial of access to work, denial of access to other provisions that essentially confer the means of life onto people, and particularly the deputisation of public services and private sector services into immigration control by creating obligations on those services to actively enforce limitations and to report people who they consider to be accessing services but not having the right. So banking, health, further education, housing, and criminally sanctioning those organisations who may have reasonable cause to believe that someone isn't entitled to access them, but fail to check. And that idea of reasonable cause has been argued successfully in some cases to create an obligation of subjective assessment that encourages racial profiling and refusal of services. Other aspects of deputisation involve removing information sharing firewalls between services, health and education. For example, in England, those firewalls were removed and then put back in when people found out. The placement of officers in local authorities, so when people approach local authorities for help, immigration officers are on site to respond. And we see the primary and clearest impact of this was Windrush and the consequences of the Windrush scandal. But essentially, this idea of kind of spectacle of illegalities, as somebody called it, everyday interactions with services lead to eligibilities being questioned, to resources being refused, potentially to settlement being jeopardised, and everyday actions becoming threatening to people's overall well-being. Now, the Scottish context, just quickly, is interesting because it combines two things. First of all, the overarching children's services policy called GIRFIC, which was designed to address fragmentation and failures in early intervention in Scotland by creating a shared and universal understanding of what child well-being is that could then be used across all policy and practice. There have our indicators here, the Shinari indicators, as they're called. I can let you read them by yourself. And then the kind of overall outcomes on the outside. Responsible citizens is an interesting one, an interesting choice of words. I'm not going to get into that today particularly, but it's based essentially on this idea that well-being is a universal and can be a universally understood concept, can be applied across all children in a way that's equal. It claims kind of an apolitical universalism, but actually well-being is a very complicated topic, covering lots of different ideas and lots of different ideological bases. I won't get into all of those. I'll touch upon some of those a little bit later. And then there's also stuff relating to migration and the apparently more welcoming orientation towards migrants in general, towards migrant families through the New Scots policy, although there have been criticisms that the integration model in that still is about the colonial management of cultural difference. And there has been an increased focus in Scotland relative to England on issues relating to separated and trafficked children and in child protection guidance, which I think reflects something we'll talk about a bit later, which is the use of vulnerability as a category to offer resources to those considered more deserving, and to not, in order to justify its denial from those considered less so. But I think one of the key things for me is that beyond these specific provisions for migrant children, they are invisible everywhere else. They are invisible in the child poverty strategy. They have historically been invisible in the child protection guidance, but less so these days. They tend to be invisible in lots of other policies unless they very, very specifically relate to migrant children. And that, for me, perpetuates the idea that there are children, and there are migrant children, and there are things that apply to children, and there are things that apply to migrant children, and those are two different things completely. And I think one of the consequences of this is that there's a dynamic of invisibility, or selective visibility, that leads to children's needs often going unseen and unaccounted for, being unaddressed. And we have to consider the localized variation and localized interpretation of the multiple scales of immigration policy, from the devolved all the way up to the reserved, and how complicated that can get. And that's kind of what my research was looking at. So I brought in the candidacy framework, which is a framework designed to cover why inequalities in service provision exist in the interaction between the identities and the resources of prospective service users, and the particular characteristics of services. And it has all these particular elements, not a trajectory, not a linear trajectory, but a heuristic to kind of show the recursive and dynamic nature of people's access to and use of services. The ones I'm particularly focusing on today cover this idea of identification, that when somebody accesses a service or pursues a service, they are identifying themselves as someone with a need for the service to meet, and as somebody worthy of that service's care and time and attention. And this is a real space of anxiety and uncertainty, because it is an issue of identity that isn't often considered when people talk about service use. Navigation, getting to the point of use of a service that requires resources to get there. And I'm going to adapt that using some Bourdieu. And services being designed essentially and delivered in a way that reflects the idea of a ideal user, somebody who uses services precisely in the way they're intended for precisely the problems that providers have identified, with the exact set of competencies and resources required. And that's reflected particularly in systems of permeability, of how easy services are to access, and particularly adjudications that are often made upon practitioners' heuristics, the categorizations, the stereotypes they have about who is or isn't worthy of a service, who can and can't use it, and how. And I think that's a really important thing when we think about service use in general, and particularly for the groups we're talking about today, and a little bit of Bourdieu on top, just for extra points, I guess. The resources in candidacy have often been under-theorized, so I decided to chuck capitals in there. So the ways in which resources are distributed and gathered up by people and used to pursue social advantages or against social disadvantages. So economic resources, cultural capitals, particularly legitimate ways of knowing and being, knowing how a service works, for example, and knowing how to present oneself in a way that a service will respond to. And that's particularly relevant for the concept of habits, the idea of the kind of unspoken and semi-spoken, semi-conscious ways of moving through the world legitimately, in the ways of actually pursuing one's goals in the world, and a particular role for social capitals in here. And we're talking about fields, so those stratified social spaces where when people put their resources and their capitals to use, they are possibly rewarded, possibly sanctioned, possibly legitimized by the forces of those fields. So we have the fields of the services themselves and the fields of the migration system more generally. The column on the right, some of the is a little bit of the findings related to the first part of my PhD. I won't go into those just now, but essentially, people's access to resources and access to capital processes being restricted significantly by their migration status in a way that was really harmful to their well-being in lots of different ways. A lovely paper that I published last year on that very topic at the bottom, if you're interested. And then finally, and particularly in capital processes, the idea of recognition, that when one approaches a service or one approaches somebody looking for help and support, they are seeking recognition as a legitimate subject and a legitimate person, and whether services withhold or whether services actually recognises people, as worthy, as deserving, is really significant. Axel Honneth's work, for example, shows how recognition is a crucial part of identity and the intersubjective creation of identity. It comes through expressions of care, recognition of people's rights and solidarity, and misrecognition comes through denial of any of those things. But Honneth's problem is that Honneth comes from a kind of weirdly idealistic world where liberal democratic states build on the pursuit of recognition and justice. But our anti-colonial perspective shows us that the pursuit of recognition and justice relies upon the exclusion and the misrecognition of other people. The image of the citizen, the image of the person, is built upon the denial of personhood to others. And so Bourdieu and Fanon again question that idea and show how capital processes and recognition actually reproduce domination, and denial of recognition is really important. Essentially, one is beholden to the rules of the field in which one wants to be recognised. And the being and non-being distinction in Fanon is based upon the basic unrecognisability of people in non-being, who are constantly placed in the position of seeking validation of themselves from powerful and colonising forces and making themselves recognisable and more human in the colonizers' terms. Not wanting to be too deterministic about this, I think it's clear, and more recent anti-colonial materials talked about how people actually actively reckon with and negotiate with and even actively refuse to participate in these processes of recognition. So they are not totalizing, but they're still quite important. And we get for time limited. So looking at some of the findings, I will buzz through these early ones fairly quickly. In terms of the identification of candidacy, the migrantization process and the categorization process both suppresses and produces different candidacy identifications. It suppresses people by excluding them through categorization, but also by creating gaps between categories that don't reflect people's lived realities and creating a level of complexity and opacity and confusion that simply is impossible for people to reckon with as they move through the migration system. And it also produces candidacy both by denying people the means of independent, self-sustaining lives and forced reliance on services, and particularly third sector services, that pulls people into services and systems of migration management like asylum support, but also reducing life to a series of problems that only services are able to meet or that require the input of services. So we might consider, for example, the significant mental health impacts of precarious status and how they increase the likelihood that somebody is going to require input from perhaps the NHS in order to address the issues that are coming up, I guess. Cultural and emotional capitals are kind of entwined here. So knowledge and fear and anxiety. We might also think about confidence and self-esteem. The fear of discovery and the fear of negative responses and invalidation of identities was really important in people's interviews, but also so was the corrosive stress and the overwhelm both of the difficulties of precarious status, but also being forced into constant, repetitive, and often exclusionary candidacy processes could really stress people out and overwhelm them and make it harder for them to navigate to services. And knowledge plays a really interesting role. I think in a lot of the existing research upon this, there's this idea that if people lack or people exist in a deficit in terms of the knowledge they have about service systems or the ways they're able to access them. And I think what my findings showed is that isn't a particularly helpful picture, that people's knowledge was often pretty good. At least one of the parents that I spoke to was a lawyer. who had a very, very good knowledge of the law and a very good knowledge of their rights, and that did not seem to get them any closer to getting the things that they needed from services, simply because of the gap between formal entitlements and the kind of implicit or tacit rules of engagement. The ways in which their knowledge was often undermined by movement to a new place where things work differently, movement to different forms of status and the incoherence that results in that, where they perhaps had a very, very good sense of how to access and navigate service systems when they had one form of status, and now with a new form, things become very, very different. And in a context of fear and in a context of anxiety, all of this becomes very, very difficult. And the quotes on the right, I think, show a bit of that. Friends, family, and social networks were really crucial. This is a drawing from one of the young people involved, Eva, who was 14, who drew lots of different friends. You can see family friends who covered all kinds of forms of similarity, from cultural and linguistic shared background to shared experience, who then helped them to access a broad range of services and help them understand both the formal rules and the more tacit rules as well. And friends were sources of knowledge, of shared experience, of reassurance and moral support, often of childcare for parents who were looking to access services, help with travel sometimes popped up, and in one case even acting as a next of kin that allowed somebody to sign up for a service they otherwise wouldn't have been able to access. But families in these situations were experiencing a pretty relentless pressure towards isolation and pressure on those relationships, from hypermobility and moving between different spaces, from loss of access to social spaces or inability to afford or maintain access to social spaces, from poverty, and issues in social participation, stress, and the difficulties that creates in making and sustaining relationships, and the strain and the breakdown that often followed, issues of trust and mistrust. All these kinds of things made it very, very difficult for people to make and sustain the relationships that were needed to navigate service systems. Movement was a challenge for all manner of reasons. Costs being one. This is pre-bus pass legislation, so costs were often really, really difficult. And you kind of end up with a complicated cost-benefit question for people. Do I go to this new place? Do I go to this new service based on my past experiences, which have often been difficult? Is there a chance I'll simply be turned away? And can I maintain existing relationships? For example, if I've been moved from one part of Glasgow in dispersal accommodation to another part, and can I manage and maintain that? And a number of families did, often in really difficult circumstances, maintain connections to really important services by spending the little money that they had on bus passes, often, and then making up the shortfall by relying on food banks, relying on friends and family, relying on other things because of the importance of maintaining those resources for travel. And it's more than a logistical thing and more than purely a practical thing. There are questions of challenges of navigating around an unfamiliar environment, particularly if you are being moved around between it. The disorientation that can often come from things like stress and poor mental health, and the challenges of practicality, particularly for parents. This quote on the bottom shows how difficult it could be to get out of the top floor flat with a baby and a toddler, and how draining that might be for somebody in order to access the services that they need. And then getting into the kind of recognition stuff. There are questions of whether services actually support people's language needs, and how it's experienced as a form of disregard and a lack of respect when they don't. How hard it could often be for families to communicate their complex circumstances, and how hard it can be for services to respond. And often families describe this particular pathology of recognition called invisibilization, a harmful and disdainful disregard, the withholding of warmth and acceptance from families who would go to services and find the response that they received in schools and social work departments and health services was outwardly hostile, outwardly disrespectful, outwardly discriminatory. And the reasons for that were the families described different reasons for that. Personal prejudices being one, the wider political environment and the stigma related to that being another. But one of the really crucial ones that one of the family support workers described was what she called the hassle factor. And that speaks to the idea that people simply don't fit. The service is aimed at a particular group, and these families simply don't fit within the accepted bounds, the accepted heuristics, the accepted categorizations. And that makes things difficult for the workers, and the response of workers who often have limited resources of their own is invisibilization and disregard. And that's when people were adjudicated by services and offers made by those services, really a very consistent A very, very consistent theme that they were simply refused services at the first port of call because their needs and circumstances often fell beyond those ideas of the ideal user we talked about earlier. Things being unseen, needs being misunderstood and often misattributed. So a couple of the quotes on the right there. The top one, the idea that a child who in this situation was very clearly experiencing the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder, being dumped and seen as kids that can't speak English with behavior problems because of a lack of an understanding of their past circumstances. In the middle example, a parent who was also experiencing the effects of post-traumatic stress, but that was put down by social workers to an instrumental attempt to manipulate the Home Office. And generally speaking, I sense that people's difficulties, challenges, needs, circumstances were framed as a consequence of their own personal deficits rather than the situations they were experiencing. And in recognition terms, we would call this reification, that reduction of people to objects, stereotypes, a static kind of people without context, without backgrounds, and without other aspects of their lives other than the problems they're experiencing. And I think one of the key influences that the hostile environment has had and the current immigration system has had, and the reduction of people to the different forms of immigration status has had, is that it reduces people in the eyes of services to being problems, to the sum of their problems, and to being problematic. And that is kind of example here. And yeah, as I mentioned, consistently, families, parents, children, professionals, refusal was a really, really clear theme. The first question, they will try to get rid of you, as Harry said. And persisting is one of the crucial elements that resulted in successful access to services and successful service use, but that requires resources, it requires capitals, it requires help and support. And people were often able to persist and persist successfully, and they often relied on other people, and particularly services and service providers who could act as advocates and navigators and coordinators. And often, and I think one of the really crucial things is that the services people were often trying to use or to access NRPF services and social work, for example, asylum support services, have very, very few routes to accountability and very, very few routes to redress when negative things happen. And all of this contributes, as Jenny in that top quote says, to that sense of not belonging, not feeling human, not feeling able to participate on equal terms in society. Now, I'm going to skip our examples for just now because we're a little short on time. These family support referrals are quite important, I think, because it shows a real example where family support workers that I spoke to who were working with health visitors, social workers, midwives, were finding that referrals they got in were very much about parental culpability for family difficulties, and particularly maternal culpability for family difficulties. And the family support workers were going out and finding that when social workers or health visitors were saying parents are not engaging, parents are not attending to children's needs, parents aren't taking their children out into the world, they were going out and finding people in incredibly adverse circumstances for whom these things were very difficult, and they were not being recognised by the services that they were working with. So those quotes are quite useful examples of that. Social workers being threatening, and not providing adequate support, all that's quite important. But I think the key point, and before I move on to talking a little bit about disability, but where we're a little short on time, is that what is often framed as a policy conflict between a hostile environment and a more welcoming orientation in Scotland is actually often experienced in terms of continuity and coherence, and even exacerbation of the colonial dynamics of the immigration system. And this quote from a Finnish paper from 2024 talks about how universalism and universal attempts to build children's services systems based on ideas of universal well-being are actually limiting because they turn out to be built upon pretty contingent understandings of children and childhood and family. They reflect the needs and realities of majority population, and they limit the possibilities of discussing or properly situating the candidacy experiences, the difficulties that families are having, or as Frank in voluntary development, or indeed as Amy in family support says, getting it right for every child is bullshit. Now, thinking about disability in these situations, and where this was in the headline for this presentation, I had hoped to speak to, based on my professional experiences, to speak to families where parents were disabled, where children were disabled, but found in recruitment that suddenly became very, very difficult. And that my experiences in frontline practice, where I was meeting families fairly often, were not reflected in my recruitment attempts. And that doesn't reflect a lack of prevalence or a lack of need, but actually reflects the different ways in which disabled families have been made invisible and been marginalised in very particular ways, and are often kept out of service systems and kept out of services that are designed not to fit with their needs and circumstances. But in some respects, this wasn't the right project in which to do that work, because it wasn't built with proper consideration and design, or proper consideration and approach for disabled participants. It didn't build upon some of the insights from disability studies. It didn't build upon a more participatory methodology. And actually, it perhaps would have meant these families were an add-on in a project that was largely focused on a broader and more general experience. More recently, I've gone back to look at some of the literature of that time. And it's only recently that a lot of literature started to address empirically and conceptually some of the invisibilization around migration and disability. Some folks at Glasgow are doing terrific work on this. Nikki Burns, sadly not here today, has been doing a lot of work on this stuff. But generally, there have been attempts to address the fact that migration studies and disability studies have been growing separately, but often describing the same things, often describing the shared ways of othering, of marginalisation, of models of human worth that pop up in policy, that pop up in discourse and constructions of disability and in constructions of migration. And this paradigm is trying to historicize concepts and categories and terminologies used to describe disability, used to describe migration, to expose how these two concepts have actually been really closely intertwined in the past, and to chart new paths for research. So some of the crossover here, we are often talking about, one moment, let me just get my notes up for this bit, I'm well behind, how the social construction of disabled populations and the social construction of migrant populations is often based on their presumed biological inferiorities, histories of scientific racism and eugenics, Malthusianism, and actually more recently things like the Great Replacement are popping back up and talking a bit more about this idea of protecting a healthy public from contamination by an unhealthy or an unworthy public. We start seeing things about parasite identities. Disabled people and migrants are both framed in ways that focus on their productivity, on their lack of contribution and their potential burden to the public purse and to the economic viability of a capitalist state, and also as threats to public health and moral health, and particularly racialized discourses around eugenics and public threat. And more recently, a lot of work by Rebecca Ewa, presented here not that long ago, about neoliberalism and austerity and the ways in which disability more generally is being reframed as not a source of rights, but as a place of charity and of discretionary humanitarianism. There are some examples there, but I'm kind of going to skip that. This idea of discretionary humanitarianism that reduces disability to an individual tragedy or as a health issue, and not as a matter of the disabling power of social structures, of environments. And in the case we're seeing here of politics and policy, that frames government as a benevolent force and a protector of resources by focusing attention on those who deserve and are more worthy, to the exclusion of those who aren't. And often frames families and caregivers as defective, as inadequate, as lacking resilience and lacking coping strategies, and migrant children often again as victims of their parents' deficits and their poor decisions. So setting new terms, in order to address this stuff, I think the key that this new paradigm has come up with is the need to historicize a lot of the key concepts we're talking about. So moving from a static frame of migrants to processes of migrantization, moving from disability as a health tragedy towards that social model of disability as something that's produced by social structures, and moving away from that idea of the universal childhood to understand childhood as a structural and social category as well, and looking at the ways in which all these three things overlap. Recent work on the disabled family, I think, is really important, that understands the interdependencies, the care, the relationships that occur within disabled families, but also contextualizes them in social structures, and looks at processes of agency and demands for participation and demands for power in often really marginalized circumstances. And we are starting to see more empirical studies on family life and migrant families, but they again tend to focus on health services and health status. They often focus solely on parents and parents' perspective and on how parents are coping, where children are often framed as burdens or as difficult or are reduced to kind of static burdens. A lack of critical approaches with some of the theoretical and conceptual literature, and a lack of more collaborative and participatory methodologies, although there are some promising examples there on the right. I can point people towards if you're interested. So the directions that I think are particularly interesting that haven't really been covered yet. I did attempt to get a little bit of funding for a sort of historical sociology study on disabled migrant families in the UK. That didn't work out, but looking at the ways in which families have been structured in historical discourses, I think is really interesting, but particularly getting into the lived experience of migrantization and disability in family life through participatory methods. So actually, rather than me setting the direction, and this is kind of cheating because I did talk about direction in my overview for this, is actually handing that over to families and actually trying to work out, using some of the insights from critical disability studies and emancipatory research, what are the priorities for these families? How best might these families be able to participate and be facilitated to participate in research? And particularly, how can this contribute to advocacy and actual tangible improvement? And really the other questions to be determined through collaboration. And as a final point, from both migration studies and disability studies, that sense that people don't get to set the agenda in this work, very rarely get to set the agenda in this work, and to ask the questions that research should be asking about. So my hope is that I'll be able to design some kind of research that hands this over. And that's where I am at the moment with this. But I will stop there because we're a little tight on time, and I suspect there may be questions. But thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Thank you very much.